Art Rocks is made possible by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you.
Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Chelsea Norris of Anne Connolly Fine Art, filling in for James Fox Smith. Textile art can take many forms, but the tradition of quilt making blends the idea of art and function. Judy Holley is a national award-winning quilt maker in Baton Rouge. Her quilts are truly unique works of fine art.
In 1998, I had a quilt that won first places in every show that it was in, including the one in New Orleans, and then the Mid-Atlantic Quilt Festival in Williamsburg, Virginia, and then it also won something in Houston at the International Quilt Festival that year. Raspberry Parfait is a New York beauty block, and it's something I always wanted to try. And I was at a fabric store, and I saw some 30s prints on sale. That's always a good excuse to buy something. But one of the prints on sale looked exactly like the fabric that was in my mother's kitchen when she bought this old 30s house in central Mississippi. It looked like the curtains we took down. And so I bought that, and I bought some friends, and they were on sale, and for about a year I kind of gathered up all this fabric that was Depression era 30 type prints. And so I made her a New York beauty quilt out of those Depression era prints for her 30s house. When you look at the New York beauty blocks and you see all the points, I actually cut strips, and they're paper piece, so I'm not cutting out any little pieces. I'm making them from strips, and I just cut as I go. That is what's called an offset log cabin. I'm attracted to curved designs, and when you do an offset log cabin, you can actually do circles with it if you choose to. Now, I chose to do a clamshell pattern with it, and at the time my son was living in Japan, so I was collecting Japanese prints. It was just a good excuse to buy fabric, and since he lived in Japan, I bought Japanese prints and made that quilt. The Railroad Through the Rockies pattern is another way that I could use a New York beauty block, and it was traditionally gave you a broad open space that represented the plains as the railroad went across the country. Nice place to hand quilt or to showcase your quilting. So I decided to use my New York beauty block in that kind of setting. And I had bought a Australian print for the border. I taught a lot of quilt classes for probably 25 years throughout the Gulf Coast area mostly. I started sewing at 16. I was in a girls' trio for several years, and we had all of our dresses alike. And I liked my trio clothes. I didn't like the ones that were store-bought. And I liked going to the store and picking the pattern and picking out the fabric. My mother made my trio clothes, but she didn't like it. My grandmother was a Depression-era quilter, and her quilts were all over her houses, but she was old by the time I came along, and I never actually saw her quilting. She talked about it. We slept under the quilts, and at one point when we lived in her house, her quilting frame hung over my bed, suspended from the ceiling. I never saw a quilt in it, and I never saw anybody using it. I knew what it was for, and I always said, one day I'm gonna make a quilt. When I was 16, I took my money I got for my birthday, and I lived in Connecticut at the time, right in the middle of the textile industry. And I went to one of the local mills and bought fabric and everything I needed, and shut myself up in my bedroom with a sewing machine, and when I came out, I had a dress. I've been sewing ever since. I made my first quilt right after my son was born. Then I just kind of played around at it. I didn't actually follow directions. I just kind of did my own thing. And I did that for about 15 years. And finally, I just decided I wasn't progressing. I was going to pick a pattern, actually read the directions, and start very traditionally and do a traditional block and something like that. The first book I bought in 1970. It was the only book that was still in print on quilting. It was published in 1949. It's by Margaret Ickes. It's over there on the shelf. I work with a lot of traditional patterns, and I have a quilt program that's electric quilt. A lot of traditional patterns in there. You can also draft your own patterns in there, and then you can print out any block in any size that you need. I work on the computer a lot. I don't really design that much on the computer. I do some, a little bit, but I like designing at the design wall. I like the fabric to tell me what to do. Originally, I pieced by machine and I quilted by hand, and I did quilt by hand for quite a few years. And you finally get to the point you're not going to be able to finish all these quilts. Hand quilting takes a while. I decided to learn to quilt on a domestic machine. And a lot of people now use a big, long, professional long arm. I didn't even know what that was when I was learning how to quilt. So by the time I was aware of what long arms were and what they could do, I had already mastered quilting on a domestic machine. So I have no desire to change. The Juki actually is an industrial strength machine, but the batting doesn't really cause much of an issue. Sometimes there's a lot of bulk in the seam allowances that you have to sew over, but it's not an issue with the Juki. I had one machine that if you weren't using the exact needle specific for that technique or that fabric, it wouldn't sew. Most machines aren't that persnickety. I do use predominantly cotton. Men's shirts are great. Do make quilts from dead people's clothes often. Usually that's for family members. When I made the quilt for the family and he had beautiful shirts, 100% cotton, high quality, they wanted their quilt and I got to keep the rest of it. And I like using woven fabric. I'm adventuresome. I will still use other fabrics. I collect ties and people just give those to me. They're predominantly silk, but they can be acetate, they can be polyester, they can be wool and silk blends, they can be cotton. So you're putting them all together. You have to wash it in cold water and not put it in a dryer. I have a quilt in the front made from Japanese brocades. If you're working nonstop on a project, I made a quilt for my boss in about 2 weeks. 4 to 8 hours a day. That was maybe twin size, or a large lap or twin. Quilting is compulsive, and once you start, it's something like you need to do, or you have to do. And I probably sew some every day.